even though the societal order almost mitigates against the kind of deep community that we need in order to repair what's broken and in order to create the world anew, our ability to reach out to one another is the antidote. But once again, that's another thing. If I stay only in my pain, then I am at risk of not being present for yours.
Are you at a crossroads with your bank? With ClickSwitch, find and move your recurring transactions to Amplify Credit Union in just 90 seconds. That's less time than it takes to cross Congress Avenue. Make the switch to fee-free banking and never pay another bank fee again with ClickSwitch from Amplify Credit Union.
Hi, I'm Mindy Hoffman, and welcome to the Women of Austin podcast. Today we have a very special guest with us. She's a Democratic presidential candidate, a Texas native, best-selling author, activist, and so much more. I'm so glad to be sitting down with Marianne Williamson. Hi, Marianne. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's really special because I know that you're just in town for a little while and you took the time to sit down with us and talk to the women of Austin, and that just means everything. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
So I want to learn a little bit about your time in Texas. So you were born here, right?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Houston.
Nice.
And then I lived here, even though I went away to go to college in California. I was, I've been back quite a few times. I mean, I was here back in the 70s. I lived in Austin for about half a year. And then back in 2008, I would live here for a couple of years. I came back when my mother was ill, when my father was ill. Have family. That was, when I say here, actually, that's Houston.
Oh, yeah. Yep. Do you miss Texas?
You know, I do in a way, in the sense that I think I should have come back here. But although I sort of regret not coming back in the 90s, my sister had cancer. And I look back at the fact that she was diagnosed with cancer at a young age with 3 little girls. And who I am now, can't imagine my not moving back to help. And that's a little bit of eternal shame. I remember my mother said to me, "Would you consider moving back?" I was living in LA at the time. And I said, "Oh no, Mommy, I couldn't." And like I said, I look back now and I wish I had.
Now that's interesting that you say eternal shame, and that's something that I actually wanted to ask you about a couple things. So that makes me think of a couple things. When you were in LA, you were doing work with AIDS patients, correct?
Yes, I was.
Was that at the same kind of around the same time?
And there was a relationship between those two things as well, because I started a center that had to do with the fact that people around me were contracting and dying of AIDS. But the fact that so much of that struck me so deeply, of course, had to do with the fact that my sister was ill. And also that was before everything was on computer and internet. So today there are ways in which you could be anywhere and do the same work that was not true in those days. So, and I think eternal shame is a little hard hitting. Maybe eternal cringe, but not really shame. I mean, I've certainly processed that.
Now, I feel like everybody has things from their past that we feel like maybe we made the wrong decision. And you said you processed it. What did you do to process it? Or someone who's trying to process something, what advice would you give?
Well, I think life is a series of lessons. And as you get older, you definitely look back. You know, so much happens in your younger years. And, you know, George Bernard Shaw said, youth is wasted on the young. There's just so much you don't know yet when so much is already happening. And so you look back and you know, everybody ages with a level of woulda, shoulda, coulda. I don't think you can escape that in life. But I also think that when you say, how do you process it? you own it, and you seek to be a better person now. What happened for me in that situation, I knew in those years the singer Bonnie Raitt. And there was a time when her brother was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and she stopped everything to go be with him. And that was the brick to my forehead that I needed. Because I said to myself, Bonnie Raitt has a much bigger career than you do. And if she would stop everything to go be there for a sick sibling, it just cracked me open, and I saw something. And I think in life, the only real failure is something you fail to learn from. The only real failure in life is something that you fail to let turn you into a better person now, a more compassionate person now, a more sensitive person now. And I think particularly for women, when you are a young woman, you have dimensions of power. Just the fact you have youth and you have beauty and you have it going on, that you don't even realize why you have it, because you've never not had it.
Oh, yeah.
And so you don't realize the power that you wield. And I think most of us age and look back and wonder if we were as responsible towards ourselves and towards others as we might have been, because the older you grow, the more fragile you realize people are. That's, I think, the biggest lesson of age. Not only your own fragility, but everybody else's as well. But it's life that teaches you those things. And, sometimes you don't know until you know. But I do think once you do know, the universe sort of holds you accountable for certain things.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And that actually, I have something from your book that I think this aligns. You wrote A Woman's Worth, and a passage that stood out to me is, more women cry, loudly or silently, every fraction of every moment, in every town of every country than anyone, man or woman, realizes. We cry for our children, our lovers, our parents, and ourselves. We cry in shame because we feel no right to cry, and we cry in peace because we feel it's time we did cry. We cry in moans, and we cry in great yelps. We cry for the world, yet we think we cry alone. That, I'm tearing up right now just reading it, because I've definitely felt alone and afraid and ashamed to cry. I've talked to my friends before. I've called them, I need to cry, but my daughter's here. Do I cry in front of her? I don't know what to do. And why do you think it is that we feel that we need to cry alone?
Well, I think life is painful.
Yeah.
It's the bottom line. But when I wrote that book, I just turned 40 years old. And for me, it was sort of like, this is what I've learned at 40. But I think that the culture moved to an interesting place. At that point when I wrote that book, which was in the 1990s, there wasn't the allowance, there wasn't the permission to own sadness, grief, trauma, all of those things. And the society has moved forward to the point where I think there is more prevalence of people who would say to you, what's really wrong? Let's talk about your pain, your grief, your suffering. To be honest, I think we have taken it too far. And I think it's time for the pendulum to shift back. We went from stiff upper lip, which was not healthy, to almost a glorification of our pain. And I think particularly for women right now, particularly for the state of the world, we need to be asking not only what is your pain and how can I support you by listening to it, but what is your power? What is your strength? And how can I support you in putting it out into the world? There's been almost a glorification of pathology in the last couple of decades that, no, I don't think is healthy. There are a lot of hours in the day. You cry and you get out there and make it a better world. And I would remind any American woman, what are our tears compared to women in Afghanistan living under the Taliban, who can't even leave their house, who could get beaten in certain countries, or even killed if the hijab is not on correctly. The Taliban telling women just the other day, you can't go to the national park, was there one place they could go. So I think sometimes it's to hold each other's suffering, and other times it's to say to each other, toughen up, Buttercup.
Yeah.
Because with power comes responsibility. And I think that sometimes we forget how much power we have, not only in the ways we talked about earlier, being who we are, but being citizens of such a powerful country, being privileged enough not to be scraping every day just to get by. I think these days the message of women needs to be, wake up, smell the coffee. We've got to save our democracy, and we've got to try to save this planet.
I love that so much. I think that, too, when women come together and are honest with each other and have real conversations, that's when we can talk to our friends like that and people like that.
And we need to then take it to the next place.
Yeah.
So, yes, we don't sit around and just talk about stupid things. I mean, there's a place for that in life.
Right,
Don't
right.
get me wrong. But then when you talk about your pain, I think we need to move it forward to the pain of other people than just ourselves.
Yeah. I actually I'm in recovery, and I went to AA, and one thing that I learned was that you take your pain and everything that you're going through and you help the next person, and that helps your recovery.
It not only helps it, you can't keep it unless you give it away.
Ooh.
I mean, that's the spiritual principle. So on the mortal plane, if I give you this glass, I won't have it anymore. But on a spiritual plane, you only get to keep what you give away. And of course, that's a principle of recovery, not only to help the newly recovering person, but to help the person who's trying to maintain their recovery. And that's that principle that everything you do, you ultimately do for yourself. You become generous out of self-interest, because the separated self, the atomized self that is bred by an overly consumerist society, has us all living within these separate cages of our own making. And even though the societal order almost mitigates against the kind of deep community that we need in order to repair what's broken and in order to create the world anew, our ability to reach out to one another is the antidote in any situation, in any moment. But once again, that's another thing. If I stay only in my pain, then I am at risk of not being present for yours.
Yes.
That's why it's important, which is important to own it, it's important to process it, but it's also important to get to the point where you have alchemized your own enough that you are able to be present to other people. That's the difference between being in recovery for 6 months versus recovery for 6 years. I mean, there are times in your life when you're overwhelmed by what you have to move through, but then the point is, yes, once you've moved through it, enough. I mean, we're always learning, we're always growing, we're always faced with the challenges. But the goal has to be at a point where you're not so overwhelmed by your own darkness that you can be present as a light in someone else's life. And when I hear women, oh, it's so traumatizing. If I look at what's going on politically, it's so traumatizing. Are you kidding me? Do you know how traumatic it must have been for people walking across the bridge at Selma? Do you know how traumatizing it must have been to be one of the women's suffragists?
At Amplify, we are getting rid of all banking fees, so you have a little extra to sprinkle around. No fees equals more sprinkles. Amplify.
Women of Austin would like to thank our community sponsors. Joel Richardson and team, your Austin mortgage lender. Visit myfinanceteam.com. Dave's Ultimate Automotive. Visit Dave's Ultimate Automotive and become a part of the Dave's family today. Warren Callion Maddox, Attorneys at Law, a proud minority and women-owned business enterprise. Thanks so much for being here for the Women of Austin podcast today. We're filming at 1717 Valeria Street. This is a listing from Wise Property Group. It is an exquisite new construction home featuring 4 bedrooms, an office, 3.5 bathrooms, a rare 2-car garage, and a heated pool. This timeless design plays homage to the classic elements in traditional homes with a modern sophistication you won't find in other homes on the market. Stop by 1717 Valeria to see something different in Central Austin. You can find more information on this home and Wise Property Group in the show notes. When we're in pain and we're feeling pain because of other things that are going on that are close to us, and we learn and we're able to process those. But what about the pain of just you here talking about the Taliban controlling those women? Like that, I feel that in my heart. So when people are learning about what's going on in the world and then they're feeling that pain, I know to take action is definitely what we should do and find ways to come together. But I know that personally, my natural instinct is to separate from it because it hurts, but I want to get involved and be educated and help. So do you have any advice for how to deal with that? Because you know what's going on in the world. You are at the point where it sounds like can't take it anymore, and you're running for president because you want to be able to make the biggest change. And
one of the biggest lessons I ever learned was her name was June Smith, and she was my high school drama teacher in Houston. In my 20s at some point, I visited with her, and she said to me, I think I put it in my book, Return to Love, she said, do you ever think about anyone but yourself? She actually said that to me, and somebody needed to say that to me. And what is your pain thinking about the Taliban, the women under the Taliban, compared to the pain of the women living under the Taliban?
Yeah.
We're so precious. And when I hear women, it's so traumatizing. If I look at what's going on politically, it's so traumatizing. Are you kidding me? Do you know how traumatic it must have been for people walking across the bridge at Selma? Do you know how traumatizing it must have been to be one of the women suffragists who, for the crime of doing nothing other than marching for the women's right to vote, were thrown in prison? And the conditions in the prison were so awful that they went on a hunger strike. And the response of the prison officials was to send men into their cells to force these metal contraptions onto their necks and force feed them. So you think we're anxious and we have trauma? I mean, can we please, once again, no, I'm not minimizing any of those things that, yes, we must process. And it was to our detriment that we didn't. Obviously, once again, I wrote the book.
Yes.
However, there's always seeking the balance, and the ego will always take us too far in one direction or another. So grieving for the women who are living under the conditions of the Taliban is the first step. The second step is, wait a minute, didn't we go to war with the Taliban? What happened? Third step, well, we went there, but for the last 20 years that we were there, we made some spectacular mistakes to the point where the people of Afghanistan only hated us a little bit less than they hated the Taliban, then failed so spectacularly that once we left, it only took 10 days for the Taliban to come back in. Now, once again, great respect for the men and women who died from the U.S. Armed Forces. and who, died in Afghanistan. But we as Americans must look at this. And then when we left, although I understand the argument was time, given what was, we did not prioritize rescuing many of those women. It's so tragic. So we can't live meaningful lives unless we do allow our hearts to break. And we do allow ourselves to, at this point, there is a limit, but we can be part of international pressure. There's a limit to what we can do for the women in Afghanistan at this point, but we can be part of an international wave of pressure. And we as women living in the United States, the average American woman cannot imagine what it would be like to just not be able to leave your house unless a male relative went with you. And you have to be dressed a certain way. And I remember reading, there's a wonderful book called The Dressmaker of Kirkana, which I read, I think that was even before 9/11. I just think the highest point of meaningful life is one in which we are beyond just our own circumstances. And where we are asking, how can my life and my circumstances be of service to those who do not have. Now, I'm not saying you don't have your problems, and I'm not saying I don't have my problems, and I'm not saying that all the women we've been talking to today, everybody has their issues, and I'm not denying that. And at the same time, the level of privilege is beyond what the majority of people on this planet could even imagine. Are we to feel guilty about that? Absolutely not. But should it expand our sense of possibility and understanding? I always say we should honor our incarnation. How lucky were we that we are here? No matter, there are exceptions to this, don't get me wrong, among women such as ourselves. But for the most part, I look at situations, children in Somalia, children in Yemen, children living certain places in the world, and then I look at my own little granddaughter. Some people just hit the birth lottery. And I think and she's got these loving parents, and they're living in London in a Western democracy and just surrounded by love. And she'll have her trials in life, that's life. But I think there's something to asking ourselves, what is the highest space I can inhabit within my own circumstances in this lifetime? And how can I not just think about what I don't have, but what do I have that could be of value and of service to a wider circle than just myself? And I think that conversation I had with June Smith all those years ago started me on a trajectory where I can honestly say that in general, the best advice I can ever give myself in any situation is get over yourself. This is not about you. And I also think that the higher consciousness community, of which I certainly consider myself a part with my books, et cetera, we have fostered some of that. Jesus didn't arrive on the earth to say, love yourself. That was not the message of the highest religious teachings. It's not love yourself. It's love one another. Right. Practice mercy and justice. So as important as self-love is, it's love of others that is the highest spiritual mountaintop.
Ready to break up with your bank, but stressed about having to redo all your direct deposits? With Amplify Credit Union's new tool, ClickSwitch, it's easy to make your money move. With just a few clicks, you'll be on your way to fee-free banking in less than 90 seconds. Order up! Before your coffee order is ready. Make the switch to fee-free banking and never pay another bank fee again with ClickSwitch from Amplify Credit Union.
Coming up on our next episode of the Women of Austin podcast, join me for part 2 with our special guest, Marianne Williamson.
But we have forces here who don't want that to happen because they want to hoard the money in a small group. So they call that socialist. Ooh, you're being a socialist. It's just a PR narrative. That's all. And so young people, particularly today, they're not buying any of that PR nonsense, but they're also very depressed about it.
Thanks so much for joining us today on the Women of Austin podcast. A new episode premieres twice a month right here on the Women of Austin channel. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notifications bell so you never miss an episode. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at women_of_Austin. My name is Mindy Hoffman. I hope you'll join us for our next episode of the Women of Austin podcast.